Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. It's a great pleasure to have David Blei here with us as today's keynote speaker. So just before I introduce David, let me quickly remind you about the keynote format and how we're handling questions. So just as with the earlier keynote talks, we ask that you hold most of your questions till the end of the talk. The main exception to this is if you have a very small clarification question, you're welcome to ask it during the talk. In both cases, to ask your question, please type your question in the chat box in your Zoom window. I'll monitor the chat box. If there are questions during the talk, I'll briefly interrupt David when it seems appropriate, and I'll read out your question to him. For questions after the talk, I'll call on you to unmute yourself one at a time, and you can ask your question directly to David. Okay, I am thrilled to welcome our keynote speaker for today, David Blei. David probably does not need much introduction here, but let me tell you a little bit about him anyway. So David is a professor of statistics and computer science at Columbia University and a member of the Columbia Data Science Institute. He studies probabilistic machine learning, including its theory, algorithms, and applications. David has received several awards for his research. In particular, he's been a recipient of a Sloan Fellowship, an Office of Naval Research Young Investigator Award, a Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, a Blavatnik Faculty Award, an ACM Infosys Foundation Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Simons Investigator Award. He's a co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Machine Learning Research, and he's a fellow of the ACM and the IMS. Many of us know David best for his early work on developing topic models. Today, he's going to talk to us more broadly about scaling and generalizing approximate Bayesian inference. David is known for his rich and clear talks, so I know we're in for a special treat. Welcome, David. The floor is all yours.
Thanks very much, Shivani. Thanks very much to both of you for inviting me to be a keynote speaker. It's a big honor. I was hoping to see Austria, but I'm happy to be here virtually. I'm going to talk about scaling and generalizing approximate Bayesian inference. So as Shivani said, I work in probabilistic machine learning, and just want to make a few remarks about what probabilistic machine learning is at first. It goes without saying that in machine learning, one of the kinds of problems we tackle are that we have complicated data and we want to make sense of it. Okay, so complicated data might be data from the universe, measurements from space. It might be social data about people interacting on Facebook. It might be text data, like big document collections, or it might be data about consumers and purchases, for example, in a grocery store, or many other complicated data sets that we want to somehow make sense of. And what probabilistic machine learning is about developing machine learning methods that connect our domain knowledge to data in order to help make sense of it. Probabilistic machine learning gives us a methodology for analyzing data, and the goal is to make this methodology expressive so we can articulate our domain assumptions in the models and methods that we develop, scalable so that we can analyze large data sets with these methods, and easy to develop so that we don't have to do a lot of work in order to go from our data and our assumptions to some kind of method that forms predictions or otherwise find some kind of understanding in the data. Of course, if you're a statistician, you know that these are all the same goals as applied Bayesian statistics, and the boundary between probabilistic machine learning and applied Bayesian statistics is definitely fuzzy. So just some examples of some of the work we've done in my lab over the years on probabilistic machine learning. Here's a picture of communities uncovered from a big 3.7 million node network. Here's a picture of topics. Fanny mentioned topic models. These are topics found in 1.8 million articles from the New York Times. These are groups of words associated under a theme discovered by the probabilistic model. This is a population analysis of 2 billion genetic measurements. This is trying to understand what are the ancestral populations that mix to form our genetic signatures. Here's a picture of a neuroscience analysis of fMRI, trying to understand what areas of the brain light up when we look at different types of objects. Here's an analysis of taxi trajectories, understanding what kinds of taxi rides people take in a city in Portugal. And here's a fancy discrete choice analysis of supermarket purchases. This is work I did with an economist, with Susan Athey, on analyzing a large collection of people shopping at the grocery store. And it's basically embedding items. In this picture, I don't like to make jokes over Zoom, but in this picture, it's showing you that crackers and cheese go together. That was the big result of that particular analysis. So all of these are examples of taking a big complicated data set and try to make sense of it. And I like to think of probabilistic machine learning as following this pipeline, the probabilistic pipeline, where we separate making assumptions from doing computation, from then applying the results of that computation. And this flowchart might seem silly, but the idea is that we take our knowledge, our domain knowledge, and the question we want to answer, we turn that into some concrete assumptions about the hidden and observed variables in our data set. Then we use our data and those assumptions to uncover the hidden patterns in the data, and then we use those patterns to do whatever it is we're trying to do with the data, form predictions or explore clusters or whatever it is. And thinking of the world this way helps collaborate with domain experts on statistics and machine learning problems. Now, what I want to talk about today is the key algorithmic problem to this pipeline, which is posterior inference, taking the probabilistic model of hidden and observed variables and the data and using them together to infer what the hidden variables are given the observations. Posterior inference answers the question, what does this model say about my data? And what I want to talk about today are how to make posterior inference scalable and general. Okay, so sorry, the slide I skipped just says this pipeline is really a cycle that we want to build a model and then we want to criticize the model, go back, refine our assumptions, and so on. Okay. So let's get a little bit more formal about probabilistic machine learning. So a probabilistic model is a joint distribution of hidden variables Z and observed variables X. Okay, so in one of those pictures, the hidden variables might be the communities that we don't know in advance, and the observed variables are the connections between nodes in a big network. Inference about the unknowns happens through the posterior distribution, which is the conditional distribution of the hidden variables given the observations. Here it's P of Z given X, which you all know is the ratio of the joint against the marginal distribution of the observations. For most interesting models, the denominator there, P of X, is not tractable. And so this is what motivates approximate posterior inference. I've decided that I want to analyze my data through P of Z given X. I can't calculate P of Z given X, so I need to appeal to approximate posterior inference. Variational inference solves the approximate posterior inference problem by turning it into an optimization problem. And took us a long time to draw this little cartoon, but this cartoon really explains all of variational inference. If you want to log off of Zoom, if your kids require attention at this point, you will have gotten everything you need to out of this talk. So I can't point. Oh wait, maybe I can. You can see this hand. So here's what this picture is. P of Z given X is what I want to approximate, the conditional distribution of the hidden variables given the observations. What I'm going to do, can you see this hand? Anybody? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a family of distributions, Q of Z with parameter nu, where this is a parameterized family of distributions over the hidden variables, right? Each value of nu corresponds to a different particular distribution over those hidden variables. And I'm then going to optimize the parameters of that family to be close to the unattainable posterior that I want to work with, all right? And I minimize, in particular, the KL divergence between Q and the exact posterior and find nu star. And then I simply use nu star as a proxy for the posterior that I can't calculate. It's that simple. So this is the idea behind variational inference. Positive family of distributions, optimize that family to be close to the posterior you care about. Okay, you contrast this, for example, with MCMC, where we want to build a Markov chain whose stationary distribution is that posterior. Here we're doing something else, but the goal is the same, approximate the posterior. Okay, here's an example where here we're drawing data from a mixture of Gaussians. Okay, so you can see the data are these colored points, but we don't get to see those colors in the analysis. And we're trying to cluster the data. And what we've plotted here on the top is the posterior predictive distribution under the approximate posterior given by Q at different stages of that optimization. As I'm marching through that space of Q distributions, how good is the corresponding posterior predictive? And you can see that as we optimize Q, the posterior predictive gets closer and closer to the true distribution of the data. And here, the evidence lower bound, we'll talk about that in a little while, that is getting bigger and bigger. That corresponds to the KL divergence becoming smaller and smaller as I go through this optimization trajectory. All right, so that's variational inference in a nutshell. The history of variational inference, just as a short aside, so we understand the context of where these ideas are coming from, this idea really came in the 90s by adapting ideas from statistical physics to probabilistic inference. So the idea of variational inference was ported from statistical physics, and people like Tommy Yakula and Lawrence Saul, Zubin Germani, Mike Jordan, they in the 90s working together generalized it to many, many probabilistic models. And people like Jeff Hinton and Radford Neal and David Mackay and others at that same time were also adapting it to probabilistic variants of neural network models. So this is where the first kind of set of ideas around variational inference emerged. It was in the early 90s and the early 2000s. But today there's been something of a renaissance in terms of variational inference, where there's a lot of new work on variational inference, making it scalable, making it easier to derive, making it faster, making it more accurate. And it's begun to touch many areas of machine learning, like probabilistic programming, reinforcement learning, deep learning, convex optimization, Bayesian statistics. And so that's part of the purpose of my giving this talk today is to talk about some of these newer ideas in variational inference that really built off these ideas from the 90s, the seminal ideas by people like Hinton and Jordan and Mackay and Neal and Yakula and all the other names. Good, so the purpose of today's talk is to say that stochastic optimization helps variational inference. I know that many of you know and are experts in stochastic optimization. And it turns out stochastic optimization can play a big role in solving some of the problems that plague variational inference, the early incarnation of variational inference. One, stochastic optimization helps us scale it up to massive data sets. And two, it helps us generalize variational inference to a wide class of models. Right, and I should say that the work I'm going to talk about today, this is my work with some amazing collaborators, Matt Hoffman, who's now at Google, Rajesh Ranganath, who's now at NYU, and Alp Kuchu-Kelbir, who founded an amazing startup called Faro Labs. Okay, so we'll begin with stochastic variational inference. As motivation, we'll talk about the early work mentioned, topic modeling. Okay, so topic modeling is a useful tutorial model for learning about variational inference. What topic models do is they use posterior inference to discover hidden themes in large collections of documents. And the model that I worked on 20 years ago is still a good model to learn about variational inference from. It's called latent Dirichlet allocation. And the idea behind LDA is that documents exhibit multiple topics. Okay, so here's a picture of an article. I also made this picture almost 20 years ago. And it's an article from the journal Science about seeking life's bare genetic necessities, meaning they're trying to understand how many genes does an organism need to survive in an evolutionary sense over millions of years. And what I did was, by hand, I highlighted different words like organism, survive, life, words about evolutionary biology, genes, genomes, sequence, words about genetics, and computational analysis predictions, words about data analysis. And the idea behind LDA, we'll get back to variational inference in a second, the idea behind LDA is that if I highlighted all the words in this document with a different color, and then you squinted at the document, you would not know what the document was about, but you would know that it somehow blended ideas around evolutionary biology, data analysis, and genetics. Now, this is the kind of first box in that probabilistic pipeline where we're taking our domain assumptions, that was some domain assumptions I just articulated for you, and translating them into a formal probability model. Now we're going to translate those domain assumptions into a formal probability model, and here it is. This is the latent Dirichlet allocation model. And the idea is that there's a bunch of topics out there. Okay, and each topic is a distribution over terms. So here the topics are on the left, and you can see some have words like gene and DNA with high probability, some have words like life and organism with high probability, some have words like brain and neuron with high probability, and so on. Imagine all the topics of the corpus or of the world are distributions over terms, and they're sitting there on the left. And then for each document, what we're going to do is we're going to first choose a distribution over topics. That's this cartoon histogram here. Here I'm choosing the pink, yellow, and blue topic, and I choose a colored button from that distribution, and I choose the corresponding term from the distribution over words that is associated with that topic. And I repeat this over and over again. You can kind of imagine if I generated a document that way, that would produce an article that blended data analysis, evolutionary biology, and genetics. Okay, then you turn the page of science, you're going to write a new science article, choose a new distribution over topics. This one might blend neuroscience and data analysis and draw its words. Okay, so this is a model of language, not necessarily a realistic one, but one that captures this intuition that documents exhibit multiple topics. Now, that's a formal probability model articulated through its generative process of hidden variables like topics and topic assignments and observed variables like words. The problem is, this is the problem of probabilistic machine learning, we don't get to observe all that stuff. We just observe a big stack of articles. And so what we want to do is calculate the posterior, the probability of the topics, the topic proportions, and the topic assignments given this big stack of documents. And note that in a modern application of this idea, there will be millions of documents and therefore billions of latent variables. Also notice that we've just translated the problem of uncovering topics in a collection, which is kind of a fuzzy qualitative goal, into one of a posterior inference. We've set up a formal model, and now our problem is how to calculate this conditional distribution. Okay, so in probabilistic machine learning, we like graphical models. So here is LDA as a graphical model. This is basically a schematic of that generative process. It defines the factorization of the joint distribution of hidden and observed variables that it implies. And as many of you know, it connects to assumptions and algorithms and ways to work with that family of probability distributions. But here I can just point out that I can read off the generative process of LDA from this graphical model. First, I choose K topics. Those are beta 1 through K. So the plate here means replication. So there's K distributions over terms. Then for each document, I choose topic proportions, theta. Those are the little cartoon histogram. And then for each word in each document, I choose a topic assignment, Z, and then I choose a word by looking up which topic the topic assignment is associated with and drawing the word from that topic assignment. Right? So this is a picture of that generative process and defines the joint distribution of the hidden variables. The hidden variables are unshaded, like theta, Z, and beta, and the observed variables, the words, W.
So David, there's a question here if you have a moment. The question is from Shai Ben David. He asks, is there any ground truth here? The generative model is clearly unrealistic, so how do you define ground truth or loss?
Great, so we're gonna get there into there is no ground truth, except I guess the documents themselves are ground truth. This is an unsupervised learning problem. And our goal is to define that and then to calculate this conditional distribution, P of beta, theta, Z given W. To evaluate these kinds of models, there are different ways. Sometimes somebody uses an unsupervised learning method because they want to understand and explore their data. They have a big, messy, high-dimensional data set and they want to just understand what's going on, so they want to find some clusters in it just to give them a qualitative sense. Often in Bayesian statistics and probabilistic machine learning, we use something like held out log likelihood. How good of a distribution of words did this capture? How good was the distribution of words that this model captured given my observations on future unknown documents? The idea being that even though this language model is obviously a bad model of language, it's not going to produce realistic language. Within the class of topic models, a better topic model will produce new data that has higher probability than a poorer topic model. So I hope that got to the short answer is it's unsupervised learning, so it's anybody's guess what a good loss could be, or alternatively, whatever you're doing with your model defines that loss downstream. Okay, so with the generative model in place, the posterior of the latent variables given the documents looks like this. So this is an application of the idea I mentioned before. P of beta, theta, and z given W is a ratio of the joint distribution and the marginal distribution of the documents, which is that big integral, which we can't calculate. So we're going to use variational inference. By the way, Shai, there will be an explicit loss function when it comes to variational inference. And we'll get there in a second. Okay, so imagine we've used variational inference. What do we get out of it? Well, we take this, we take this collection of documents, we estimate the topics, we estimate the conditional distribution of the topics and the topic proportions for each document, and we can see, and now we can examine it. And so here we have our article, and we ask for 100 topics here, and so we get an approximate posterior distribution of the topic proportions for this article, theta, and you can see here that it found some histogram that's sparse, and turns out, of the 100 topics. So what the variational inference algorithm is saying here is that the approximate posterior of the distribution of theta is centered at this particular distribution of topics, 100 topics. Now, not knowing what the topics are, this might not be that useful, but remember, each topic is associated with a distribution over words, and we can also look at the approximate posterior of those topics. And so what we see is that the main topics that this document has somehow activated have, with high probability, words like human, genome, DNA, genetic, words about genetics, words like evolution, evolutionary, species, organisms, words about evolutionary biology, words about diseases, and words about data analysis. So this is the sense in which this is unsupervised learning. In comes just a big collection of documents. Out pops a posterior distribution over topics, topic proportions, topic assignments too, though we're not showing them here. And the topics and topic proportions seem to have some kind of meaningful structure or interpretation, although I understand that that's not a very rigorous loss in the sense of just human interpretation. Now, with the ideas that we're going to talk about today, we can scale this up. So that was 17,000 articles. That's like what we could handle in 2003 or 4 whenever we ran that analysis. Now we want to run analyses. We want to approximate posteriors with many, much larger collections of documents. And so here are, for example, the topics found with 1.8 million articles from the New York Times done using stochastic variational inference. Okay, so with that motivating model in place, I want to talk about mean field variational inference, the classical ideas, and stochastic variational inference. And we're going to define a class of models. We're going to derive the classical mean field variational inference algorithm for that class of models, and then derive stochastic variational inference, which scales to large data sets. So here's a class of models. I call them conditionally conjugate models. And here's the graphical model and the corresponding factorized joint distribution. So the probability of beta, z, and x is the probability of beta times conditionally independently the probability of z and x given beta. All right. The observations are x. We call z local variables. These are hidden variables, but there is one hidden variable per data point, z1 through n. We call beta global variables. And the distinction between local and global variables is that the ith data point xi only depends on the global variable and its own local latent variable. Okay, that's the way that we define the distinction. And so, of course, we want to calculate the posterior probability of beta and z given x. So that's the class of models we're going to work with. There are going to be a few more restrictions on the class. First, the complete conditional, I want to define that. It's the conditional distribution of a latent variable given all the observations and all the other latent variables. All right, so for example, the complete conditional, and sorry, we're going to assume that each complete conditional is in the exponential family. Okay, so P of zi, sorry, let's look at the second one first. P of beta given z and x, that's the complete conditional of beta. It's the distribution of beta given all of the local latent variables and all of the observations. Notice that's different from the posterior, and it's a property of this model class, right? That's just a thing that we can calculate based on the joint. And we're going to assume that it's in an exponential family. Exponential families, for those of you not familiar, is a family, or family of distributions that encompasses many of the distributions you know and love, like the Poisson, the Gaussian, the gamma, the Dirichlet, the beta, categorical, and so on. These are all exponential family distributions. All right, and so what that means that it's in the exponential family is that I can write it down as an exponential family, and its parameter, which is denoted by eta sub g here, is of course going to be a function of all the things I'm conditioning on, because I'm writing down this conditional distribution as an exponential family. Okay, P of zi also has a complete conditional, the local latent variable. Its complete conditional is only going to depend on the global latent variables beta and the ith data point. And the reason for that is the conditional independence structure that's implied by the graphical model. Right, so P of zi given beta and xi is also in an exponential family. Its parameter is denoted by eta sub L, and it's a function of beta and xi. Okay, and then down here, this is the general form of all exponential families. All those distributions I mentioned can be written down like this as a normalized exponential of a linear function of a parameter and a statistic. Okay, so that's I'm restricting attention to that whole class of models where all the complete conditionals are in exponential families, and it has this, and the joint distribution has this factorization. And turns out that that describes many, many, many models from the machine learning literature in the 90s and 2000s. Bayesian mixture models, Dirichlet process mixtures, multi-level regression, stochastic block models, factorial models, matrix factorization. Each one involves different squinting at what's a local and what's a global variable, but you can write down all of these models as instances of conditionally conjugate models. Okay? And this includes LDA. Okay, and some of the variants of LDA that are out there as well. There's also a lot of models that are not conditionally conjugate. We're going to get to those in the second part of the talk. Is there a question?
Yeah, David, there's another question for you. This is from Akshay. He asks, is this already based on conjugacy? I feel like I would have specified the model the other way, P of x given z and beta, rather than P of beta given x and z.
P of x given z and beta. So your feeling is right, and I share your feeling. We also could specify the model, and often do, where this, you see where I'm circling with the hand? You could write this down as P of z given beta, P of x given z and beta. And that lets you reason about what that likelihood function is. In other words, and that's natural in real applications. Like, I want to sit down with the astrophysicist and ask, like, okay, how does the observation relate to this local structure and the global structure about the universe? And that's reasoning about P of x given z and beta. And then you might ask about the prior of z. I don't like to call that a prior, it's really part of this likelihood function, but the P of z given beta part of it. So I agree that often we want to write it down like that here, and that's equivalent here. Hopefully that answers your question. Good. Now, to be clear, and there might be some point of confusion now that I meditate on your question a little bit. We are not specifying these things, okay? So these complete conditionals are derived from this joint distribution. And what I'm doing is I'm constraining the class of models to ones where I can write down these complete conditionals as exponential families. If you're familiar with Gibbs sampling, this is the Gibbs sampler, right? In the Gibbs sampler, I write down my model. I sit down with the physicist and write down my model, and then, or whoever, and then I ask, what are these complete conditionals? And then I iteratively sample from them, right? That's a Gibbs sampler. And we know that that's a Markov chain whose stationary distribution is the posterior that we care about. And so what I'm saying here is that we are constraining the class of models to be ones where the joint of the hidden and observed looks like this, factorizes this way. And when I take that joint and I calculate the complete conditionals, I get exponential families out. And it's not all models, but it's a bunch of them. Okay. An interesting line of work would be to simply write down these conditionals, define those functions, and ask questions of when could those conditionals lead to a real model, and what kinds of assumptions is that model making? I'd not thought to do that, but that might be an interesting way to think about how to specify probability models in a different way. Okay, so again, we're going to play the variational inference game. And this is the only picture you need to know, that we're going to set up a distribution, a family of distributions over Z, and we're going to optimize to minimize the KL between Q and P, where P is the posterior. So the evidence lower bound. It turns out, bad news, this KL divergence here is also, we can't calculate it. And you might imagine that we can't, because it involves the this term P of Z given X that we know we can't calculate, because if we could calculate it, we wouldn't be having this talk. And so what variational inference does instead is optimize something called the evidence lower bound. This is a term coined by John McAuliffe and Michael Braun in a 2008 paper, but it's been used for many years before that, the bound, which is a lower bound on the log marginal distribution, which is, of course, the problematic term in the posterior. And it turns out that maximizing the elbow is equivalent to minimizing the KL, okay? So this is an objective function, and maximizing it is equivalent to minimizing the KL. The difference is a constant. And here is the elbow. It's a function of the variational parameters nu, and it has two terms. The first term is the expected complete log likelihood. All right, so I take the log joint, log P of beta, Z, and X, and I take the expectation of that with respect to Q. X is, of course, fixed. Those are the observations. Beta and Z are random variables, and they are governed by Q, and so that's where that expectation is over. Okay, so that's the expected complete log likelihood. And then the second term is minus expectation log Q, which of course is the entropy of Q. Okay, and so, you know, intuitively, so again, with a little bit of algebra in your house, you can convince yourself that maximizing this minimizes the KL. But staring at the elbow, it's also intuitive. The first term asks Q to place its mass on the map estimate. If you look only at the first term and ask yourself, what distribution over the hidden variables would I want to use if I only optimize the first term, you would, of course, place a point mass on whatever configuration of the hidden variables maximize the log joint. And that is the map estimate, the maximum a posteriori estimate. The second term, so if I only optimize the first term, all my Q's would be delta spikes at the map estimate. The second term is the entropy, and that encourages Q to be diffuse. These trade each other off. The spike, of course, is going to have the lowest possible entropy, and so the second term wants Q to be spread out, which means spreading out its mass across some configurations that don't necessarily maximize the first term. Okay, one caveat is that the elbow is not convex. Another open area of research in variational inference is to look into that, look into how we might be able to understand why optimization seems to perform well despite the fact that the elbow is not convex. Okay.
David, another question from Shai.
Yeah.
He asks, can this be thought of as a sum of empirical loss plus a regularization term?
Yes. So there's another, you know, it can, and this goes back to that other question too about specifying P of X given Z and beta. There's a great paper by Matt Hoffman and others called elbow surgery. I can't remember, it's got such a catchy first two words that I can't remember the second part. It might just be called elbow surgery, where he looks at all these different ways of writing down this objective function. And one of them indeed looks like a regularized empirical loss, where the first term is the expected log likelihood, right? So log conditional likelihood. So the first term is the sum over your data points, the expectation of log P of Xi given beta and Zi, right? And that's like a natural loss function, right? If X is Gaussian, that's going to be squared loss essentially. And then the second term is the KL divergence between the prior P of Z and beta and Q. Sorry, the KL divergence between Q and the prior. And that acts as a regularizer. So the first term says, okay, I want to fit the data as well as I can. The second term says, wait, let's pull back and have Q somehow be close to the prior specification of these latent variables, which connects, of course, to just the way Bayesian statistics works, which is this push and pull between listening to the data and listening to the prior. So yes, the elbow can be seen that way too. Okay, good. And I recommend Matt's paper called Elbow Surgery. It's a great paper. Okay, so this is the elbow. And so we need to optimize it, but of course we also need to specify the variational family. And the form of Q of beta and Z defines that variational family, that ellipse in my cartoon. And in this talk, we're going to use the mean field family. This is something that researchers have relaxed, but the mean field family is fully factorized, And so here it is, Q of beta and Z depends on variational parameters lambda and phi, where the variational family has beta and Z and each Zi, each one independent and each one governed by its own variational parameter. So in topic modeling, every topic has its own variational parameter, and every document's proportions has a variational parameter, and every word in every document in terms of which topic it's assigned to has its own variational parameter. Okay, it's a little bit of a crazy object from the statistical perspective. It's just a huge group of independent random variables that are totally disconnected from each other. But they are, of course, connected to the problem at hand through the elbow, through the objective function that we are optimizing. Now, moreover, we're going to make the assumption in this part of the talk that each factor is in the same family as the model's complete conditional. All right, so if P of beta given Z and X is an exponential family with parameter eta G, Z, and X, then Q of beta given lambda is going to be in the same exponential family, but with a free parameter lambda. More concretely, if beta given Z and X happens to be a Gaussian whose mean and variance are some kind of function of Z and X, then Q of beta is going to be a Gaussian with free Gaussian parameters lambda. If P of beta given Z and X is a Poisson, then Q of beta with lambda is a Poisson with a free Poisson parameter. Right, and this is going to be true for every random variable. That's how we can fully specify this. Sorry, I'm so used to pointing at slides. This is how we fully specify these variational factors. Okay, and so then with that all done, we've now boiled down our problem into something we can work with on a computer. We can optimize the elbow. The elbow is the expected log joint plus the entropy of Q. And what traditional VI does, all the NeurIPS papers in the 90s and 2000s, is use coordinate ascent, which means we're going to march through each variational parameter, holding each other one fixed, and optimize it, right? So march down all the variational parameters one by one, optimizing each one, holding the other ones fixed. And it turns out if you take this perspective of conditionally conjugate models, you can generalize that coordinate ascent algorithm, where the coordinate update for the global variational parameters lambda is the expectation under Q of the natural parameter under its exponential family, eta sub G of Z and X. And the coordinate update for the local variable is again, the expectation of the natural parameter of its complete conditional, eta sub L, beta, and X. All right, and you can see from the perspective of coordinate ascent how the mean field assumption is helping us. I don't want to call it an assumption. The mean field family is helping us because we are guaranteed, thanks to mean field, that even though this is a function of Z, which is the random variable here, that it's not going to be at all in the context of Q dependent on lambda, because Z is totally independent of beta in that family. Similarly here, beta is totally independent of Z in the mean field family, and so we are guaranteed that the left-hand side and the right-hand side won't involve the same parameter. All right, and notice the relationship to Gibbs sampling if you're familiar with Gibbs sampling. In Gibbs sampling, I iteratively sample from those complete conditionals. Here, I'm iteratively updating something similar to the thing I'd be sampling from. Okay, so back to Earth for a second. Let's go to LDA. And just to show you how this applies, again, there's the LDA model. I annotated this model now with variational parameters for each of the latent variables, one for each topic, one for each document's proportions, one for each document's assignment. The mean field family just has each of these things independent, and classical VI just marches through all of those variables over and over again and updates them. All right, that's how I got this picture of the topics assigned to this document. And that's how I got the topics themselves. In comes 17,000 articles, do coordinate ascent variational inference a bunch of times, and you can get this decomposition of your corpus into topic proportions and topics that are interpretable. Okay, but the problem is that classical VI is inefficient. And you can kind of see why. It has to do local computation for each data point, and then aggregate those computations to re-estimate the global structure, the topics, and repeat. Right, and this can't handle massive data. So it's just speaking concretely for LDA, we initialize those topics to be random things. Okay, they don't look anything like this. They are just random sets of words, essentially, random distributions over words. And then we painstakingly analyze each document according to those topics. How does this document exhibit this random collection of topics and then re-estimate the topics. Now, with 17,000 articles, that's fine. But if you want to analyze millions of articles or a billion articles, then it's a giant waste of time to march through a billion articles analyzing how each one exhibits some garbage topics that the computer made up to initialize. And so stochastic variational inference scales up this idea to massive data. Okay, and so the cartoon structure for stochastic variational inference looks like this. I have massive data and I have my global variational parameters. I'm going to subsample data. I'm going to infer something about the subsample data using the global variational parameters. I'm going to update the global variational parameters and I'm going to repeat. Okay, and I'm pretty sure, you know, when we started working on this, maybe we needed to talk a little bit about how we're going to do this, but I'm sure now almost everyone here knows the key to imagining this kind of structure is stochastic optimization. Okay, so we're going to basically use stochastic optimization to optimize the variational objective function, the elbow. Again, stochastic optimization invented by Herb Robbins in 1951. We replace the gradient with cheaper, noisy estimates of the gradient. And when we do that, we are guaranteed to converge to an optimum of the objective function, or in the case of an objective function like this, we're guaranteed to converge to a local optimum. And this algorithm really has enabled modern machine learning. I know there are many experts on stochastic optimization here at the session, and that I don't need to make this point. Like, why can we analyze billions of data points with logistic regression? Because of stochastic optimization. So how are we going to use it in this context? Well, we're going to use noisy gradients to update the variational parameters. Nu of t plus 1 equals nu t plus some step size rho t times a noisy gradient of the elbow, L of nu t. Now, what does stochastic optimization require? It requires one, unbiased gradients. All of this is, of course, up for grabs, but if I read Robbins and then maybe read a few papers from Botu, which is what we did when we developed this work, you know, how would we then implement this? Actually, really it was read Robbins, read a few papers from Botu, and then have a drink with Francis Bach. Those are the three things that happened, and then this talk came about. So we need unbiased gradients. So the expectation of the noisy gradient needs to be equal to the true gradient. Okay, that's here, the unbiased gradient, and the step size sequence needs to follow the Robbins-Monroe conditions. Again, that's going to be fudgeable, but at least for the classical realization of this, we need rho to go down not so fast that it can't reach anywhere, but fast enough that it can converge. So that's stochastic optimization. Now, there are some specifics for variational inference I want to bring up. How to apply this how to apply stochastic optimization to variational inference. In this world of conditional conjugacy, the complete conditional of the global variable is in an exponential family. And in particular, it has a special form. Okay, so eta sub g of z and x is going to equal alpha plus a sum over all the data points of some function, I'm calling it t here, of zi and xi. Okay, where t is some function and alpha is the hyperparameter to the prior of beta. Beta is going to have some distribution, p of beta, living in that joint distribution in the joint for the graphical model, and it's going to have some parameter alpha. Now, this is not an assumption. This is just true. When the complete conditional of beta in that class of models is in an exponential family, it has to take on this form, right? And this is from the classical theory of conjugate priors in Bayesian analysis. Okay, it's a theory written down, I think, for the first time by Diaconis and Ilvisacker. I've never said his name out loud. In the late 70s, you know, a good place to read about it is in Bernardo and Smith's 1994 book on Bayesian theory. Now, when you know that the complete conditional looks like that, you can write down the coordinate descent update as alpha plus sum I equals 1 to n of the expectation of t of z and xi, where that expectation is taken with respect to q, but of course, this little function only depends on phi I because it only depends on zi. And now you can see the problem. For large data sets, this update's expensive. I can't update the topics unless I've calculated this function for every single document. And if I have millions of documents, that's going to take a long time. Now, second idea we needed to do this is the idea of the natural gradient. The natural gradient of the work of Amari since the 60s is about gradients of parameters to probability distributions that make sense when you account for the geometry of the distribution, loosely speaking. And these gradients are good in a lot of settings, in neural networks, in maximum likelihood and other places too. And here, the natural gradient has a very nice form. So this is the natural gradient. It is basically the coordinate ascent update minus the parameter that we are taking the gradient with respect to. Okay, and now the natural gradient has lots of nice statistical and geometric properties, but to be clear, the reason we're using it here is that it has a form that is amenable to stochastic optimization in the context of the elbow. And so what we can do with this gradient is construct a noisy natural gradient, sample a data point at random, and then calculate the local variational parameter for that data point, and calculate the scaled natural gradient, treating that data point n times with this formula. And you can see that this noisy gradient is good for stochastic optimization. Its expectation relative to the randomly drawn data point is equal to the exact gradient, and it only depends on the optimized parameter of one data point. So it's cheap. It's unbiased and cheap, so it's good for stochastic optimization. All right, and so that is stochastic variational inference. I'll just go through it here. The input is the data and a model, which is a joint distribution. I'm going to initialize the global variational parameters randomly, set step size appropriately, and then repeat. Sample a document, or sample, I'll do it with LDA. Sample a document, calculate how that document exhibits the global structure, the current setting of topics, calculate the scaled noisy gradient, and then follow the scaled noisy gradient, and then repeat. And this, oh, I thought I had another slide here. Okay, but anyway, I have a slide of, well, the slide has gone missing, but I have a slide of, this converges much faster than classical coordinate descent variational inference and gets to a better place. And this is what let us scale up this model to very large data sets like this one, or scale up mixed membership stochastic block modeling to large data sets, or do large scale, the Pritchard-Stephen-Donnelly population genetics analysis with very large data sets. It's by applying stochastic optimization to this variational objective function. Okay, and as I mentioned, SVI scales to now many, many models because we derived it in this kind of general sense that encompasses a lot of models from the research literature that now all could be scaled up by using a stochastic variational inference. Okay. How much time do we have? I'm sorry to ask.
Yeah, David, I was just going to flash for you.
Okay.
Let's say about 6-7 more minutes.
Okay, great. So that's stochastic variational inference, using stochastic optimization to scale up Bayesian computation to massive data sets for lots of models. The next idea I want to talk about, which is related, is black box variational inference. So again, VI solves inference with optimization. Here's the cartoon I want you to remember. Now, in 17 years ago, we wrote a paper about LDA, and it was a paper about a probability model that used variational inference, and all papers about probability models that use variational inference had appendices like this, where you derive the variational inference algorithm. Okay, this is appendix A.1 from our paper, and it's painstakingly going through the process of grabbing the elbow, taking derivatives of the elbow with respect to things, calculating complete conditionals, not even doing that, just taking all kinds of gradients, and deriving the optimization algorithm. This is painstaking, and doing this model by model, if we want to treat probabilistic machine learning as giving us a toolbox, like Tinker Toys for creating different models based on our domain assumptions, if we have to do this every time we make a new Tinker Toy structure, then we're not going to want to play with Tinker Toys. And so the idea behind black box variational inference is that we don't want to write big appendices. We want to be able to easily use variational inference with any model, kind of automatic variational inference. Still perform inference with massive data, but not have to do any mathematical work beyond specifying the model. Somehow specifying the model is the real intellectual work of going from domain assumptions and constraints to the machine learning method I want to apply. Deriving variational inference algorithms somehow is separate from that mainline scientific task. And so as a motivation here, I want to show you the deep exponential family. Okay, this is the deep exponential family. This is some work I did with Rajesh Ranganath and others. And the idea is it's an adaptation of deep neural networks to probabilistic models. And it really generalizes earlier work on adapting deep neural networks to probabilistic models, where for each layer of the neural network, there's a latent variable. These latent variables are connected, much the way hidden units are connected in a neural network. The only difference is that they're probabilistic, so each one's conditional distribution is in an exponential family whose natural parameter is some function of a weighted average of the previous layer set of hidden variables. All right, and you can see that going here, moving down, everything comes from an exponential family. And then at the bottom, I get my observations, which themselves are from an exponential family. All right, this is a unsupervised neural network. If it was supervised, there might be some inputs going into this first Z. Okay, so now, as I mentioned, this generalizes and expands probabilistic deep networks. So sigmoid belief networks, the classical model from Radford Neal in the early 90s, is an instance of this, where these are all Bernoulli. If you have Gaussian variables in these hidden units, these are deep latent Gaussian models from Resende 2014, but you can use any exponential family. If you want to have count valued hidden units, you might use Poisson. If you want to have sparse positive valued real hidden units, you might want to use gammas. Okay, so you can kind of play and again, with the Tinker Toy analogy, define all kinds of probabilistic deep models this way. Looking at Poisson likelihoods and non-negative hidden units, we can build text models with deep exponential families, which, like topic models, find patterns of words, but also find patterns of patterns and patterns of patterns of patterns by interpreting what the hidden units are capturing along the way. Now, the problem, of course, is we want to try lots of types of defs, but how do we do inference? Defs contain cascades of latent variables, and defs do not fall into that big list of models that are conditionally conjugate. Okay, they're not. We can't calculate the complete conditional of these hidden variables given the others and the observations. Not tractable. Lots of models have this property. Okay, here's a big list. Okay, these are models you might butt up against if you restricted yourself to conditionally conjugate models. So the idea behind black box variational inference, again, easily use variational inference with any model. And the main idea is to write the gradient of the elbow as an expectation. Here's the elbow again. Then to sample from Q to form a Monte Carlo estimate of that gradient, and then to use that Monte Carlo estimate in a stochastic optimization again, right? One way to get noisy gradients is to subsample the data, but here's another way to get noisy gradients is to construe the gradient as an expectation that I can't calculate, but that I can sample, but that I can approximate with Monte Carlo. Okay, but with our goal of easy to use general variational inference, we want to keep in mind what we call the black box criteria, where we only need to sample from Q, evaluate things about Q, and evaluate log of the joint, right? Evaluating log of the joint, I think of that as specifying the model, and evaluating and sampling from Q, these are aspects of the algorithm that can be put offline, put in a library, and then once you've figured out how to do it once, you can reuse the same different variational families for lots of different models. Okay, so research in black box variational inference is about how to write that gradient as an expectation. And as I said, while SVI uses stochastic optimization to overcome large data sets, black box variational inference uses stochastic optimization to overcome a difficult objective function, one we can't calculate. And there's two main strategies for doing this in the research literature, and there's a lot of literature on this these days. One is by using score gradients, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the other is by using what's called the reparameterization gradient, which, for example, is what's used in the variational autoencoder, right? But these are both two ideas that solve the same problem, writing the gradient of the elbow as an expectation. So the score gradient looks like this. It's the expectation so the gradient of the elbow is the expectation with respect to Q of first the score function, which is the gradient of the variational family with respect to its parameter, times what I call the instantaneous elbow, the log joint minus log Q evaluated at Z, all right? And this has appeared in the research literature in several places, often without being aware of each other. In machine learning, it's also been called the likelihood ratio or reinforced gradient. And the idea is you can kind of see it intuitively just by staring at what's inside this expectation. It's going to push nu to give high probability to those values of Z that have a large instantaneous elbow. And so therefore the expectation of that elbow is going to be high too. Now, the score gradient satisfies these black box criteria. We need to be able to, so sorry, maybe I didn't make it clear enough. What we're going to do, the game we're going to play is we can't actually we can't calculate this. If we could calculate the gradient. So what we're going to do is we're going to sample from Q and then approximate this with Monte Carlo. So what do we need to do? Sample from Q, evaluate the score function. That's something about Q. So if I can't do it for a Q, I don't get to use that Q. And evaluate the log joint and log Q, right? So this satisfies these black box criteria. And then here it is. Initialize the variational parameters, and then just get a bunch of samples from the current setting of the variational parameters, calculate a noisy score gradient, and then update the variational parameters using that noisy score gradient, again, using stochastic optimization. Okay, it doesn't work. So there are some things we need to do to make it work. In particular, we need to control the variance of the gradient. Okay, so stochastic optimization works with noisy gradients. They're unbiased, but they have some variance. And that variance for these score gradients is too big if the number of samples is too low to be workable. And so there's a lot of research literature on how to manage the variance of the gradients in this kind of inference problem, always trying to adhere to these black box criteria. Other ways to innovate on BBVI is to look at adaptive step sizes, which are important in this case, things like Adagrad and the cousins of Adagrad that are used these days, and to use SVI for massive data. Still, there's nothing wrong with subsampling the data if you have a massive data set and still want to use BBVI. Okay, so again, here's the deep exponential family. We're going to use it to model documents, and every computer science talk needs a table like this that says that we do better. But the point of this talk is that we can make this table. So here, what we're doing is we are analyzing a large document collection, 2 of them, and we're looking at all these different kinds of defs with different distributions on the hidden units, like gammas and Bernoullis and Poissons, with different numbers of layers, with different priors on what are essentially the parameters, like the equivalent of the neural net parameters in the def. And we're doing all this with one algorithm, just by writing down these log joints and then plugging it into BBVI. We find that one particular configuration does best. It also does better than LDA, the model I talked about at first, as well as some other models. But again, the point is we can make this table, and being able to make this table is the contribution here. Good, and this using BBVI is how we did this complex neuroscience model with Jeremy Manning and others. It's how we were able to build this complex econometric model. If you work with an economist, or at least if you work with Susan Athey, she does not want to be limited by what is possible to calculate. She wants us to solve that problem. And so she wants to bake in the econometric assumptions that are important. And to do that, we quickly fell away from conditionally conjugate models and had to work with some of these black box ideas in order to do this analysis. This is also what enables variational inference in probabilistic programming. Probabilistic programming in a nutshell is, you saw how we talked about LDA as a generative process. First choose the topics, then choose the document proportions, then the assignments, then the words. And you can write that down as a program. Of course, it is a program. Probabilistic programming is about taking such programs and compiling them into inference algorithms. Rather than compiling them into an executable that runs the program, compile it into an executable that takes data as input and spits out an approximate posterior. And tools like Edward and I think it's called Pyro, and Church and Anglican, and there's many probabilistic programming systems, and Stan, all are systems designed to do this kind of thing. And BBVI is essential if you want to use variational inference inside a probabilistic programming system, because you don't know what kind of program the user is going to write. Okay, I'm sure I'm over time, but I'm going to beg for 2 more minutes. Can I have 2 more minutes?
Oh, that's perfect.
Okay, great. So I want to end by just giving a broad tour of variational inference with one picture. You can guess which picture it's going to be, but also kind of highlight some of the open issues in variational inference. Again, probabilistic machine learning is about connecting domain knowledge to data. and giving us a methodology for analyzing data that's expressive, scalable, and easy to develop. And you can see how those goals played a role in the ideas I was trying to present here. We take our domain knowledge, we use it to build a model, LDA, def, something else. We then take our data and that model that has hidden and observed variables and use them together to discover patterns, and then we use those patterns to proceed with life. VI gives us scalable and general approaches to posterior inference, to solving that algorithmic problem that sits in the center of this diagram. And what helps it is stochastic optimization, Herb Robbins, 1951. Helps us scale up to massive data and helps us generalize VI to a wide class of models. Okay, so with this picture, we can ask questions about what does research in VI look like? Well, one is what classes of models can I use VI for, right? In other words, that is the posterior distribution. It's a function of the joint distribution, the model class. You saw one model class in the first part of the talk. We expanded it in the second part of the talk to models that I can evaluate the log joint of. What other model classes could I expand to? So some research areas are to expand to places where models where I can't even calculate the log joint. In places like in epidemiology and in climate science and in physics, regularly scientists build simulations that are models that have hidden variables and observed variables, but are complex 1,000 lines of Fortran code that we can't calculate the log joint of a particular configuration of. Can we do variational inference there? Can we take the observed physical universe, the brilliant physics simulation, and use those observations to estimate these parameters? How can we expand the model class, the family of variational distributions? So Q is an ellipse, and we've only looked at mean field Q here. But what about looking at more structure in Q? If mean field Q is good for capturing marginals of posteriors of latent variables, but what if I care about the correlation structure among those latent variables? And there's a lot of work on that, but there's a lot of work to do on that. What about this distance metric? So here we're using KLQP. That is chosen for computational reasons. That elbow requires KLQP. Other methods try to consider other metrics, things like expectation propagation and inclusive, tries to optimize the inclusive KLPQ, which might have properties that you like. Ideas like chi-squared variational inference and operator variational inference try to define families of metrics. That said, I want to point you, I read a fascinating paper on the archive called, I think it was called Generalized Variational Inference. A very fascinating paper that made the argument that KLQP is in fact the most natural, but also argued that that when you define the metric, you are really defining your attitude towards what it means to have Bayesian uncertainty about the latent variables. I'm probably butchering their message, but I highly recommend this archive paper, Generalized Variational Inference. Especially for this crowd, can we make the algorithm better, right? So the whole thing is stemming on an optimization algorithm. And you saw here how we went from coordinate descent to stochastic variational inference, and it really enabled a lot in terms of what we could do with variational inference. But what other ways can we improve this algorithm? What are the right ways to optimize this objective function, particularly given its structure? Can we use the model, for example, to somehow help inform the optimization? These are questions that are worth looking at. A question that I don't, these are questions that are worth looking at. Finally, what is guaranteed about variational inference? This is a question that is not looked at very often. We've done a little bit of work on it with my student Yixin Wang on asymptotic normality and Bernstein-von Mises theorems for variational approximations and guarantees for VI under model mismatch. But it's wide open to understand what are the theoretical properties of variational inference relative to the truth. And this, of course, connects to just larger questions about what are the properties of modeling data relative to some kind of ground truth. And I think this is a very important avenue for new thinking. Okay, so with that, I'll conclude. Here are some papers from my own lab about variational inference that you might be interested in. Thanks very much, and thanks again for inviting me.
Thanks, David, for a very informative and beautiful talk. Yes, I'm going to clap for everybody for now, but we'll have everybody do a real clap in just a bit. We have time for a couple of questions if there are any. Okay, so let me try to have people ask questions directly now.
Okay. Are there questions?
Yes, there are a couple already. So there's one from Paxton. Paxton, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I am. Thanks for the talk. I just have a very basic question. So for example, in these LDA experiments, how do you go about deciding what the topics should be and then what should be the words corresponding to each topic?
Oh, David, I think you're muted. Sorry, let me just.
And
Oh, great.
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. You'll have to repeat. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. So just to be clear, this is a totally unsupervised model. So we set up all this structure, and but then the inference problem is indeed to solve the problem that you asked where I got them from. Given these documents, what are the topics that generated them according to this process? And so that's where we get those. That's where we get those topics from. It is the output of the variational inference algorithm, which are those topics, as well as the topic proportions and other things. Does that answer your question, Paxton?
So how do you, in this model, don't you have to like at least specify what the number of?
By the number of topics. That's right. So in this model, you specify the number of topics. There are multiple generations of PhD theses written about how to choose numbers, like numbers of clusters in mixture models and mixed membership models like this. Also Bayesian non-parametric methods, which are methods based on random measures. You don't worry about the random measure stuff, but just kind of integrate lots of stuff out. Those also provide solutions or ways to provide a number automatically from the data. But in this simple version, you provide K. So in our case, we set K equal to 100, for example. Often what happens in practice is you set K to something big like 100, and you set your Dirichlet prior to something like 1 over K or 3 over K or whatever. And then if you have enough data, what your model's going to do is probably use most of those topics, but not use all of them. And so effectively give you some model selection. And the reason it's doing that is that it's, again, this is squinting and kind of loose, but it's somehow approximating a Bayesian non-parametric solution to that problem of choosing K. So the topics are found through variational inference. K is set in advance, but there are methods, including methods that are amenable to variational inference for selecting K.
Thanks.
Yep.
Great. I'm seeing 3 more questions right now. Let's try to get through them if we can, and then we'll stop at that point. The next one is from Hoito.
Yes. Yes. So can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hoito.
Yes. So thanks for the very nice talk. So just may I know if there's any connections like between your stochastic VI algorithms and other algorithms like online EM?
Yes. Yeah. I should have mentioned that. So there are very deep connections between stochastic VI and online EM. And, you know, but actually popping up a level, there are deep connections between VI and EM. So EM, the expectation maximization algorithm, right? It starts with this bound. So it's optimizing log P of X, the function of the model parameters. And it starts out with a bound that is the same as the variational bound. And then notices that that bound is tight when you set Q equal to the exact posterior. And then it does a coordinate update where you first calculate the posterior, and that's the E step, and then calculate the, and then optimize the bound relative to the model parameters, okay? And one way to derive the elbow, is to start with the KL divergence and just proceed until you can cancel out constant stuff. But another way to derive the elbow is the exact same bound. In fact, that's the way it was done in the 90s. If you look at Jordan's And
right.
Jordan et al.'s tutorial from 1999. They get the elbow through Jensen's inequality, if you prefer.
Yeah, precisely.
And they get the bound that way. So there's a deep relationship between variational inference and EM. And also variational inference looks a lot like EM. You can see like going through each document is like the E step, and then updating the topics is like the M step. This also relates to Shai's question about, can I look at the elbow as some kind of regularized loss function, regularized conditional likelihood, for example. Similarly, read Hinton and Neal and Hinton, I don't know. Read what's the other online EM paper that's escaping me now? The theory. Who proved all the theory? Can you remind me?
That's a paper by
Eric Moulin. Yeah, Moulin and others, right? Read those papers, and you will see that they're very closely related to stochastic VI, right?
Okay.
Probably there's interesting ideas and insights and connections to make just by taking those two stacks of papers and reading them on the same day.
All right. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, great. The next question is from Gil Shamir.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in all these, thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. In all these designs, there is the question of how do you design the prior on your latent variables, especially also specifically in the black box, but also in the general. Can you relate to that?
What's that? Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so to be clear, this talk lives at the moment that you have decided on a model, or your boss handed you a model, and it's your job to calculate the posterior. So all those priors and things like that, the whole process of going from my scientific question to a probability model whose posterior I feel like answers that scientific question, we are assuming in this talk that that's over. That happened yesterday, and today we are estimating the posterior. Your question is very important for applied Bayesian statistics and applied probabilistic machine learning. To what is the effect of the priors that I choose, say on the topics, or on the topic proportions, or on the topic assignments, or on whatever the latent variables are in my joint. And again, there's a lot of literature on this. My colleague in the stat department, Andrew Gelman, writes very eloquently about how to set priors. Personally, I like to think empirically about that, right? I like to think about the empirical Bayes idea, also from Robbins, believe it or not, which is the idea that, we can set our priors so that the marginals somehow look like the population distribution of our data. And it's computationally expensive and difficult, but that's one approach. Another approach, again, going back to the question about can I perceive the elbow as a regularizer, as a regularized loss function, is to look at that elbow surgery paper and see the elbow as the expected conditional log likelihood plus the KL between Q and the prior. And then now you can just reason qualitatively about the kinds of regularization that your prior is enforcing. But it's very important in applications of these ideas to think about different priors, to understand your sensitivity to the priors, to understand how that changes the downstream inferences, and it's more to the point, the downstream decisions you make based on those inferences. It's a good point.
So in the data sets, in the examples, did you guys try different priors?
Yeah, so in the examples, we were using the way that practitioners were using LDA, which was to use symmetric Dirichlet priors on the topics and the topic proportions. And these are priors that encourage sparsity. Now, I used to think that those priors encouraged sparsity and gave us sparsity, but I think they actually just point us to sparsity, and that the sparsity of the topics and the topic proportions comes out of the particular form of the likelihood function. If you stare at, for example, LDA, you'll see that, because everything's normalized, the distribution of words given the topic is normalized, a sparser topic is going to be one that leads to higher log likelihood in the end. And so I think that those priors help the optimization push to the kinds of solutions that are going to have a good objective. That's a conjecture. So, but those, we only looked at symmetric Dirichlets. In other work, I've looked at other priors on the topic proportions, particularly priors that allow for correlation among the different topic proportions. If you write an article about health, it might also be about sports, but it probably won't necessarily be about real estate or something like that. And priors can also help you incorporate things like time series into your data, other priors. But in these experiments, we only looked at symmetric Dirichlet's. So we did maybe play with the hyperparameter, which of course controls the regularization.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, great. Let's do one more question. This one is from Chapa Chepesvari. Chapa? Chaba, are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, so I'm not hearing Chaba. I see he's unmuted, but I'm not sure.
I think I see his question in the talk.
I can read it out. Yeah, sure. So he asks how to choose the model if one is interested in causal modeling. Are there any special considerations?
Yeah. The answer to that question really is a complete other talk. It's a great question. I'm also I'm interested in probabilistic machine learning and applied Bayesian statistics. I'm also very interested in causal modeling, and there are also deep connections between these two fields. That in causal inference we think of a bottomed out mechanistic model that induces a joint distribution of observations, and that joint distribution might be somehow, you might need to reason about it in a Bayesian way, for example, if there are unknowns around it. But how to write down and select a causal model that, that's a very deep question. That gets at the core of how do we understand the world through data, in my opinion. But it's a great question. I'd love to give a talk about that someday.
Sure, we'll try to have a second talk at some point. Okay, so on that note, in the interest of time, let's stop now and thank David again. I know that there are more questions. Please join us for the coffee break after this, and perhaps if Dave has time, he'd also drop in and you could catch him there. So I'm going to everybody that we can all
predict the true model.
David.
The learner can make decisions without.
Thank you very much.
The question is how do we make this estimate? Our main result is as following. It will be the total.
All right. See you everybody at the coffee break.
Bye. Thanks very much. Okay.
Thanks. Bye.
The total square.